Thank you, Brigadier, for inviting me today. Distinguished guests, no pressure on me at all to present on EQ given the previous two presentations. Thanks, John, Jeff, for the heads up. I'll go ahead and explain what EQ is all about, but I'll talk to you a little bit first about my background. So, as Paul mentioned, my current role is a profiler in DIO, Defence Intelligence Organisation. I'm a psychologist by background. I've been doing that for the last 10 years in leading up the behavioural analysis team, and my day job is profiling political and military leaders and really looking at that strategic level of influence. So how I influence another individual to engage with them and get the most out of them, whether that's positive influence or negative influence, whether I want to get on with them or whether I want to annoy them, those sorts of attributes. So I'm looking at that very strategic level. Before I became a psychologist, I was actually in the Air Force for 10 years as a pilot flying C-130H Hercs and as a VIP fleet as well. So going back to those days as well, understanding influence, political influence, strategic influence, I have a reasonable understanding of defence. The genesis of this research goes back to 2012 when I was looking at the drivers behind insider attacks for DIO and looking at why Afghans were killing our troops and understanding what motivated them, what their decision making was, what they were going to do to potentially mitigate any further attacks. And I was looking at certain individuals who'd conducted attacks against our troops. And when I started looking at that, it struck me that interpersonal influence in those advising relationships was really critical. And I've talked to a number of people in the audience over time, and I've interviewed over 50 different advisors now from the very strategic level, going back to the days of the AATV in Vietnam, and through to more recently, 2 weeks ago, I was over in the US interviewing the likes of General Petraeus and McChrystal and Eaton, some of the four-star generals. So through that, I've interviewed a range of Iraq advisors and Afghan advisors as well. So getting a good sense of what those individuals see are important for advising going forward into the future. So my research question, what I really wanted to look at when I started looking at this, I decided I'd go through ANU's Strategic and Defence Study Centre, which John heads up. And at that study centre, I could do a research project. So I'm currently doing a doctorate and hoping to finish that this year. So studying it from 2014, I started looking at this research question. How do the ADF personnel explain the attributes they perceive are necessary for advising foreign national security forces in train, advise, assist, accompany, building partner capacity, a range of different definitions as Jeff's already presented. So in those one-on-one relationship settings. And initially I was focused on East Timor, but then I broadened that to Iraq and Afghanistan because I figured we needed the human behaviour and the skills that would be salient not just now and not just in the Middle East, but also throughout the Pacific. So I wanted to look at the core personal skills. So what am I actually looking at? I'm looking at the attributes of effective advisors and what makes them effective. And from a psych perspective, I'm looking at their psychological underpinnings of their behaviour. What are the negative advisor attributes? So what do people say are the things that exacerbate situations, that make relationship problematic? What are they doing that makes them ineffective advisors and not achieving the outcomes? But I'm specifically looking at personality attributes, the knowledge and skills that they have that makes them either effective or ineffective. And how important are these for selection and training? So in my interviews, I'm touching on all three of those questions because I'm not deployed. I want to interview advisors who are deployed. I am not there in the moment and I'm not privy to the different shifting contexts that all these people are under. So longitudinally, I'm looking over time how these relationships have changed, whether there's anything different from our Vietnam advising attributes to what there is now. Is there any difference, for example, from the guys who are training in Taji to those training 205 Corps Advisory Team in Afghanistan? What are the differences? Are there any differences in the human behaviours and the attributes that we need in these advisors? Are there any differences in those to what we've got in the Defence Cooperation Program? And what do the human attributes need to be there? and what are the attributes we need for the lower level tactical advising, you know, training in weapons handling, those sorts of skills, versus what do we need at key leader engagement? Are there some commonalities that all these people talk about across each of the skills? So I looked through the literature, and there's a reasonable amount of literature out there, particularly from a UK-US perspective, on advising and what the right stuff is for an advisor. And if you go through a lot of that literature, a lot of it taps into the, as previously mentioned, emotional intelligence attributes. Cultural understanding is a big emphasis in the literature, and other elements of intangible factors, things that people can't necessarily put their nail on the head, exactly what it is about the attributes of the individual. Well, everyone talks about the importance of selecting the right person for the job. And out of all the people I've interviewed, there wouldn't be one person I have interviewed that hasn't highlighted that there was a person that they deployed with who was ineffective and should not have been there, because they not only endangered the rest of the team with their behaviour, but they didn't achieve any outcomes that were effective, and in many cases had to be moved out of the position. So it's about having the right person for the job. So I came across in my literature search a lot about emotional intelligence. And for those who've been hearing about emotional intelligence from the previous two presenters, a definition here. There's multiple definitions in the market. There's a lot of pop psychology, and Goleman's a good example of that, the touchy-feely interpersonal skills. But the definition I quite like is from Maya Solovey and Caruso, and that's this one. It's a set of abilities, verbal and non-verbal abilities, that enable an individual to generate, recognise, express, understand and evaluate their own and others' emotions in order to guide their thinking and action. Now, what's really important to me about this piece is the thinking. Because if you have the skills to get on with a person, that's great, interpersonal skills. But emotion regulation, and that's one aspect of emotional intelligence, to me is critical in you being able to build an enduring relationship. If I'm aware of my own emotions and when I'm getting annoyed or frustrated, I can control that emotion or not. So the people who are skilled in emotional intelligence and have higher emotional intelligence are able to regulate their emotions in challenging and pressure situations. That's important, because if they don't regulate their emotions, then it impacts on their cognition and their ability to think. So if you hear emotional intelligence and you're thinking just it's touchy-feely stuff, being nice to people, it's more than that. It's an emphasis on being able to make critical decisions under pressure. So my hypothesis in my research is that individuals' self-awareness and their ability to regulate their emotions under pressure are critical in advising situations in order for the individual to make good decisions. I'll use an example. You're going into a village, an Afghan village, for example, with your team, and you're going to a negotiation with the local leader, and you're sitting down to build a relationship with this leader. A person with high emotional intelligence will be able to detect atmospheric shifts in the room. They will be able to regulate their emotions when the situation becomes more frustrating, annoying, the situation is going as planned, and they'll still be able to think strategically and make good decisions. The person with poor emotional intelligence, and we know these people, are the ones who get frustrated, annoyed, yell, bully. They don't necessarily allow their, the best cognitions or thinking in high pressure situations. That's why it's important from the literature perspective. And organisationally, we recognise this. If you look at the literature on any big ticket company, they're choosing their leaders based on selecting them through their emotional intelligence testing is one aspect of it. There's others as well. IQ is certainly important, and I would argue if we're working cross-culturally that CQ or cross-cultural intelligence is almost as important. So what does this mean behaviourally, and what was I looking for in each of my interviews with individuals? I was looking for evidence, because I'm not going and asking the advisors, is emotional intelligence really important in advising? Because I can't do that as a researcher, I wouldn't get valid data. So what I'm looking for is self-awareness, that they talk about people as being aware of the impact of their behaviour on the others, that if they're yelling and being, sorry, I typed my chest, they're yelling and being assertive with others, that's ineffectual in achieving a trust-based relationship. Self-control, stable emotions under pressure when things are either, they can upregulate and downregulate their emotions. So they can inspire, they can motivate, they can get people to do what they want, or they can downregulate. If they're getting really pissed off with a certain individual, they can calm themselves, they can remove themselves from the situation. So I'm asking the individuals those sorts of behaviours. They can identify emotional cues in others. Some people are really good at detecting changes in expression and body movements and body postures. Other people are blissfully unaware of it. You can tell that when you go to a drinks function and some people telling, a really poor timed joke or bad joke doesn't get that the people around him don't really agree with what he's talking about and keeps going on. So they're not detecting the verbal and non-verbal cues around them. We want people who are good at that, because when you're working through an interpreter, then you need to be attuned, finely attuned, to changes in the person's body language and their expressions. People that, I was asking for behaviours where people use that emotion to upregulate and downregulate, in particular to be able to inspire and motivate if they've got a group of Afghans who don't want to do what they want them to do. Some people can get them to go and do things even when they're not interested in learning. People explain a lot about empathy and how you can see things from another person's perspective. That doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with them, it just means that you can develop that understanding. Adaptability is a really big one. I wanted evidence of people being able to shift their behaviour and change and not just be set on a course of black and white, I've been told this is what I have to do, and be able to take time and go and have chai or to go and do something else, meet other people rather than be hell-bent on just one course. Adaptability is critical. So these are the sorts of behaviours I was hoping would come out from my research. How did I approach it? I conducted interviews. I've conducted about 60 interviews now with a range of different people, as I said, varying ranks and various who've advised a range of different situations. DSTG Group have also been very helpful in my research, and they've asked a number of questions in surveys they've conducted, and they conducted some very key focus groups as well from some Afghan advisors, and that research will also go into my research. I constructed out of a pilot interview with about 6 different advisors a rating scale, and you'll see there on the right-hand side there's a list of attributes that I identified from the literature and from those initial interviews, what attributes people would see as key for selecting an advisor. So I've also got all my interviewees to fill out that rating scale so I can have some level of measure of what people identify as important attributes for selection. Now, the reason I did this on top of the interviews was that often people can't verbalise what they think are the attributes, but when they see it written down, they go, oh yeah, absolutely, this one, number 4, is really important. But they've been trying to think about what it was, but when they see the list, they know exactly what it is. And so far, I haven't crunched the numbers on all of my data yet, but it is, there is significant evidence from these rating scales so far that emotional intelligence attributes are more critical over and above attributes such as professionalism. So what do I find? Out of all my interviews, very, very similar. And in fact, I haven't been surprised by any of the data. These are some of the attributes that are coming out, and they reflect the emotional intelligence attributes. Some people have come out straight and said, emotional intelligence is critical, that's what you need. And as Jeff has found in lessons learned, there are a lot of people are saying that. These are all attributes of emotional intelligence, but there's also a heavy emphasis on cultural understanding comes out. Flexibility, behavioural flexibility, shifting abilities over different situations, under different pressure situations is very important. So how relevant was EI in all research? Very relevant. People have talked about different situations where emotional self-regulation has not been apparent, how people have lost the plot and jeopardised the situations. I've interviewed people involved in the insider attack incidents as well, and I'm not saying that the lack of emotional intelligence definitely contributed to any of those, but they do talk about fractured relationships and friction in relationships in certain situations and breakdown in relationships. And it's not necessarily a case that these individuals will be able to change that, because often there is context that has preceded them and may have been the result of the advisors before them or before them. But in some cases, the emotional intelligence attributes have been critical. Sensitivity to context has come up as very important. So those people who are able to pick up on atmospherics is a key skill. Empathy has been very important as well, as has social intuition. So and social intuition taps into that cultural awareness, or understanding behaviour across different ethnic groups. Interestingly, a lot of people have suggested that maturity is very important in advising, especially at the key leader engagement level, not necessarily at the lower level, but those who are more mature tend to have more self-awareness and more ability to regulate their emotions over time. They understand the big picture better than someone who's there, who potentially is hoping to get the mission achieved quickly and get out of there. So what does this mean for us? It means that what we need to think about is to identify individuals with optimum knowledge, skills and attributes. So it's to choose the right person for the job. So what those skills are, my research will show that emotional intelligence skills are heavily important. There are other skills as well. I've been focusing my research just on those, and I would argue that there are a lot of other attributes that are important as well. Ethical awareness, a moral code, understanding, accountability, so professionalism. These are in addition to the ones that I've been looking at. We also want to attract those who want to advise. I've had a lot of people I've interviewed talk about the initially we choose the right people for the job. So when we first went into the Middle East, we tended to select the right people. And as the operations endured, it then became more just a bums on seats type role. And often these people aren't the right person for the job. They're the person who was deployable at the time. But we need to think about that, and we need to try and determine who it is that is needed to be in the job, particularly if that is an important relationship that we need to have enduring over time. We've shortened our rotations, the length of time we spend trying to build that relationship. One could argue that it takes 5 to 6 months to build a trust-based relationship. If we're rotating the whole team in and out, which we have done in many situations, then that's problematic for the relationship. And we get that our counterparts not being conducive to doing what we want them to do because we're rotating people too quickly. So it is potentially staggering the rotation cycle so that we get some people remaining there, so that we have the relationship built with some people and others are coming into the team. Also, I would emphasise that selection of the individual and the teams and preparation is a common comment in my interviews, that people don't do sufficient team skills building, identifying the right roles for the job, whether they're the logistician is in the right job or whether the other person, the engineer is in the right job, those sorts of things, advising the right people, but also whether the team makeup has the right interpersonal skills and abilities. And that last point, which I just emphasised, we need to build enduring relationships by not having a high turnover. So I'm just going to finish on that we need to provide focus training, and I'll give you a moment to read those quotes. So I've had a lot of suggestions throughout my interviews of what we need to do in the future. We certainly need doctrine, and I would suggest that at least half of my interviewees have suggested that we really need doctrine, so we're obviously taking the right steps here today. But we also need to take those steps after that, and that's consider how we prepare for our advising into the future. And that's providing the people with the right human skills so they can advise no matter what ethnic group they're going to, and have those core skills, because it's paramount for influence. If I want to influence you to do a particular role and build your military arm, then I need influence skills. And at the moment, I would argue that we're not sufficiently training in influence skills. We are skilled at training in a range of other areas, but emotional intelligence is critical to influence. If I want to influence an individual to go along with what I'm teaching him, then I need those skills. Now, that's not to say that every person on that advisory team needs the same level of emotional intelligence as the others, but critical people on that team need to be selected and assist those others on their team in understanding the attributes that they need to display with their counterpart to have success in influence. So, in other words, training other members of the team and talking about how they can work effectively as a team is important, which is what Brett Challoner was talking about there. That his rotation went in unprepared and were on the back foot in terms of how they were trained in skills. And I think we've come a long way with our lessons learned and the current training that we're doing in putting advisors, but I still think we have a ways to go in terms of what we're doing in those influence skills. And as General McChrystal says, we also need to select the right people as well. Now, I've just come back from the US and spoken to the director of the new Security Force Assistance Brigade training and have looked at their program. And I asked them whether they had an influence package in that 3-week training. At the moment, it's limited, but they're looking to put that in there, and they're very interested to see where we go in this space. And on that note, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.